ESG eCademy on life cycle cost analysis in transportation. I'm Sean Sloan. I'm the program manager for transportation policy at the Council of State Governments in Lexington, Kentucky. Those who were with us at the CSG West annual meeting in Anchorage this summer got to hear a bit of a preview about what was then a forthcoming report on our topic today from the American Society of Civil Engineers and the Eno Center for Transportation. That report is now out, and we are joined today by speakers from both of those organizations. The report notes that improving long-term decision-making in transportation will require planners and policymakers to begin thinking more about maintaining and operating transportation assets over time and factoring the accompanying costs into their planning. We know that there are agencies that already have begun to successfully implement life cycle cost analysis programs, and we will hear about some of them today. The report also includes policy innovations recommended at the federal, state, and local levels for expanding the use of life cycle cost analysis, and our guests today will take us through those as well. Before we get started, I want to explain how those listening into the webinar today can ask a question of our guests. You may do so by simply typing your question into the GoToWebinar interface on your computer screen. We will collate those here in Lexington, and I'll have the appropriate panelists respond to them at the end of the presentation. We are joined today by a couple of folks who will be familiar to those who have attended a CSG meeting or Policy Academy in recent years. Brian Palish is the Managing Director of Government Relations and Infrastructure Initiatives at the American Society of Civil Engineers in Washington. In that role, he oversees ASCE's Government Relations Department and strategic initiatives like ASCE's report card for America's infrastructure. Joshua Shank is the president and CEO of the Eno Center for Transportation, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank. He's an urban planner who has worked on federal and state transportation policy for over a decade. Before joining Eno, he directed the National Transportation Policy Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center and served as transportation policy advisor to Senator Hillary Clinton during the development of the Safety Lou authorization bill. Also joining us this afternoon is Paul Lewis. He is the Director of Policy and Finance at the Eno Center. He manages Eno's policy research and strategic finance decisions. Before joining Eno, he was a contracted researcher at MIT. I understand that Brian will kick us off by taking us through the background and purpose of the report. I think Paul's going to discuss some key findings, and Dr. Shank will take us through the policy recommendations and some next steps. And gentlemen, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I will hand things off to Brian.
Sean, thank you very much, and thank you for allowing ASCE and Eno the opportunity to present the report to your organization and to your members. We've certainly appreciated the partnership we have with you, and this is just a continuation of that. So thank you, and thanks to CSG. Next slide, or the first slide, I guess that would be. None of this, all of this sort of work that we've been doing on infrastructure really, as many of you know, and this probably is a slide that none of you are unfamiliar with on the phone, is really part of our ongoing work as we look at the nation's infrastructure and how to improve the condition. That whole notion of improving the condition is the basis. We find the basis of that to be our report card for America's infrastructure. What you have there in front of you is the 2013 report card, where the nation's infrastructure received an overall grade of a D+, which is up slightly from 4 years ago in 2009. We went from a D to a D+. Nothing to brag about, but it is movement in the right direction, which is a significant achievement, frankly, in the time that we've been doing this. We continue to see categories of infrastructure, though, unfortunately, that aren't seeing the maintenance or investment to improve their day-to-day performance or save money in the long term. We've also seen that there's a backlog of projects to maintain and modernize our infrastructure. That backlog keeps growing because we're not really being able, with the funding we have available, to address that backlog. When we're doing the report card, some of the factors that we weigh, and you can see them in the orange box there, are condition, capacity, funding, future need, operations and maintenance, public safety, resilience, and innovation. And really in almost every one of those evaluation criteria and in every single category, there's work to be done on all those things. As you can see, the overwhelming majority of our grades are Ds, and 2 of those grades are near failing, the grade with a grade of D-, levees and inland waterways. The silver lining, though, really is that 6 grades went up, and that's including some of the sectors that we're looking and talking about today, roads, bridges, and rail. Overall, we know that we have an almost overwhelming amount of projects that we need to maintain and modernize our infrastructure, and of course we have limited resources and frankly in many cases shrinking or diminishing resources. Next slide. When we put out the report card a couple of years ago, we also discussed more broadly, sort of across all those 16 categories, what are some of the key solutions that if we addressed some of those solutions across all categories that we would find there to be improvement across that whole list of categories. What we found is that from our last report card in 2009, that our infrastructure problem can be solved. It's not going to be solved overnight, but there can be movement. One of the first things we found, and it remains one of our key solutions, is that we need leadership. We need leadership at all levels of government. We need leadership from the private sector, the business community, from legislators, from mayors, all across the country. And frankly, a uniting theme of that would be a vision for what we want out of our infrastructure system. Our report card does include that kind of a vision. It's one of those things where everyone's got a vision. Some are a little different. We think ours at least embodies what we'd like to see out of the nation's infrastructure and how it in fact could perform in the future. And as you can see by these solutions, they are a little bit general. The second one is focused on sustainability, resilience, and that includes this LCCA or life cycle cost analysis. And last but not least is this notional idea that we need to focus on prioritizing, planning, and then funding the needed improvements that we have to have in our nation's infrastructure. As ASCE, we have a group of what we call our Industry Leaders Council, and that sort of gets us to our life cycle cost report here, that really attached and grabbed onto this idea of how we could improve the use of life cycle cost analysis all through the project process and all through the various categories of addressing our infrastructure. And so what we've done is through this partnership with the Eno Center for Transportation, taken a much more in-depth look about life cycle cost analysis and how in fact we can utilize more of these tools to improve the decision-making process, to get better results from projects, and in turn ultimately spend the money that is available more wisely. One of the couple of the points in the report that I would like to highlight is one of the things that we did is at the beginning of the project we actually did a couple of surveys. We did a survey, and they were the same survey, but we surveyed 2 sort of distinct groups of people. We surveyed a bunch of readers of Governing Magazine. Some of you were aware of that magazine, which obviously goes out to state, local, elected and appointed officials and employees of agencies, and got the sense from them as what they thought was going on with life cycle cost analysis and how they were utilizing it. And then secondly, we did a similar survey to our own members, and we found that there is a great deal of interest in the concept of life cycle costs, and that there was a need and a desire for some more education and tools to be made available so folks could better utilize the tenets and the process of life cycle cost analysis to, again, end up with better projects and better utilization of those funds. So with that, I'd like to, with that little bit of introduction, I again want to thank CSG for this and turn it over to Paul Lewis from the Eno Center. Paul is one of the key authors of the report, and he's going to walk us through the objectives and findings before he hands it over to Joshua. Paul, it's all you. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Brian. Again, this is Paul Lewis with the Eno Center for Transportation. If we advance to the next slide. I'm going to go through the paper, the outline, the study framework, our key findings, looking at existing federal policy, some of the case studies that we did at the state and local level, and then the lessons learned that came from this research and policy recommendations. The paper is available for download on the internet and on our website, so you should feel free to, after this, take a look at some of the details, but I'm just going to give a brief overview about what this study was all about. Go to the next slide. So the research framework is we were looking at life cycle cost analysis as a tool for assisting the planning decisions. So life cycle cost analysis gives us a long-term understanding of the pros and cons of projects, and not only of a certain project, but also between different projects as decision makers are deciding what and what not to fund. It helps to choose the most cost-effective options, and it's also part of a sustainable approach, not only from a budgetary perspective, taking a long-term view of the costs, but also can include elements such as user costs, environmental impacts, and other impacts as deemed necessary by the decision-making process. It's important to mention that this paper is not intended to be about pavement selection. Many on this call probably know that pavement selection and life cycle cost analysis, there's been a lot written about it. This is looking a little bit beyond just that specific design alternative and seeing how this can be used to inform better decision-making at a higher level. Next slide. So just some of the key findings before we get into the details of the paper. Some of the things that we took away from doing the research and talking to people at the state and local level. First of all, and we just touched on this, but life cycle cost analysis is often limited just to pavement design as it's currently used. And resources for conducting life cycle cost analysis do exist, whether that's from trade association, from academia, or from the federal government. There are plenty of guidebooks and handbooks and how-to sessions on how to conduct a life cycle cost analysis. But the barriers to seeing more of it, more of life cycle cost analysis, include training of staff, consistent data for making cost projections, and incentives for states and localities to actually use this in a regular, systematic fashion. So ultimately, using life cycle cost analysis, along with other economic analyses, as part of the decision-making process leads to higher quality projects and also improved competition and credibility for the industry. Next slide. So just highlighting some of what Brian was just talking about with our survey, ASC and Governing did a survey to governing members, readers, and ASC members, and we really took away two driving factors. First is the life cycle cost is not part of the decision-making on a broad basis, and it needs improvement, and that's highlighted in the next two slides. We'll see in the next slide. Go ahead and advance. This was one of the questions was asking survey participants how often is is an operating and maintenance plan part of the project planning process. Less than half said yes. This was pretty telling. I mean, we're talking about large infrastructure projects or any kind of project. It's less than half that people can say definitely we are including operation and maintenance as part of the project planning, and we identified that as an issue. And then the next slide, if you advance, we asked what was the status of their life cycle cost strategies, and only 28% found it sufficient or leading edge, meaning the rest of those that are using life cycle cost analysis are categorizing it as needing improvement or even inadequate. Next slide. So we started our research as to trying to identify some of the barriers and some of the opportunities for seeing greater use of LCCA, looking at the federal level, as the federal level is obviously a major provider of transportation funds and often drives the planning process. Federal Highways has traditionally served as only in an advisory role. They definitely want to encourage life cycle cost analysis and have put out plenty of pamphlets, user guides, and other resources, but they're not pushing directly or mandating that states, localities do this. We took a look at the federal planning process, and this is the state and MPO prepared STIP and TIP. The concept of fiscal constraint is as close to what we have right now as a tool to help encourage looking at life cycle costs of transportation assets and projects. But this, we found, was only applies to the first several years and does not require any kind of long-term life cycle 30-plus year look at costs and benefits. MAP 21, which is the current surface transportation legislation at the federal level, does have a asset management program, and it's requiring states to put together asset management plans, which we see as a positive step, but that has not been fully fleshed out, and we're not quite sure if life cycle cost is going to be a direct result of that. Next slide. So I'm going to walk through 3 of the 6 case studies that we worked with. Just for the interest of time, we're going to go through these pretty quickly, and we're only going to highlight 3 that we thought had pretty important lessons. First one being MTC, which is the MPO, or Metropolitan Transportation Commission, which is the MPO that governs the region around the San Francisco Bay Area. They are one of the leading MPOs in the country when it comes to performance management. They have a system that builds in life cycle costs as part of their analysis. Some of the reason that they do this, and they have the ability to do this, is that they distribute over $1 billion every year to transit agencies, roadway projects, and bridge and tunnel projects that they are directly responsible for. So they have a formalized and technical procedure to help distribute, and although that's a large amount of money, it is still not nearly enough to cover all the needs in the region, so they have to be very careful about what projects that they select. So they have a progress performance assessment that's looking at life cycle costs, and they have been able to identify projects that don't meet their standards and have either required improvements to those projects or not funded them. So it's been a very powerful tool in San Francisco. Next slide. Another case study that we thought was very innovative was looking at the North Carolina DOT. They, over the past decade, have introduced a strategic prioritization framework that looks at long-term benefit costs, economic competitiveness of new transportation investments. It's a program that allows projects across modes to compete for funding. And what was unique about this is, or what we thought was valuable to learn, is that it started out as a pilot program as an initiative from DOT leadership and the governor. So it started out fairly small. It spread to the rest of the agency as they saw that it was very successful. And then after a few rounds, the legislature codified the process into law to make sure that this would remain part of the regular transportation planning process and really solidified the program for the long term. Next slide. So the last case study we're going to go through is a public-private partnership. This was a transit P3 that was done in Denver, Colorado, where they were building a commuter rail from the downtown area to the airport. This was procured as a design, build, operate, maintain, and finance over the 30-year lifespan of the project. And what we thought was interesting here is that the private sector has inherent incentives to reduce life cycle costs. They're responsible for making sure that not only the upfront costs are low, but over the entire operation and maintenance of this asset, they are keeping their costs low so they can earn the most amount of money. And the winning bidder had an innovative design approach that saved over $300 million in life cycle costs by recognizing that they had to meet certain performance standards from an operational standpoint. And for example, they needed to only there were some areas they only had to put down one track, so only single tracking instead of double tracking, which saved not only upfront costs but long-term operation and maintenance costs, as there's not as much asset to build. Next slide. So just quick going through some of the lessons learned that we pulled out of the case studies and looking at the federal government. First of all, demonstrating benefits of using life cycle costs is really essential to get the momentum going within an agency. Nobody's going to take the investment in developing an LCCA program unless you can prove to them that it's going to be worth their time. Resources and handbooks, whether, again, that's from the federal government or it's from trade associations or academia, those are plentiful. And this report is not a how-to guide on how to perform a life cycle cost analysis, but we're looking at how do we actually get this into the mainstream. Pilot programs, as was the case in North Carolina, is really an important first step. It's a way that states and MPOs can start into this process. They can find out that it's beneficial. They can test the training of their staff before they roll it out into the broader agency. Important point that came up with many of the case studies is that LCCA is part of the decision-making process and should not and is not the end-all be-all for making project decisions, but it is really useful in informing decision-makers on what are the best projects and design alternatives to go forward with. And then finally, the private sector can be a guide, and not only because they can do the projects and innovate in ways that the public sector might not be able to, but also they can, in working with public sector officials and staff, they can see benefits of public sector staff learning from private sector techniques. Next slide. So I'm going to go through the recommendations that we have in the paper. We have recommendations for the federal level and then also for state and localities. Again, these are all detailed in the report, but the first one is tying funding to performance. This one's pretty straightforward, but obviously the federal government is going to be giving out lots of money. They can be looking at performance and including life cycle cost analysis and how infrastructure is performing on a life cycle cost basis to their funding needs. The second one was an interesting idea that came about through some discussions, but creating a discretionary grant program that could reward states that put together innovative asset management programs. So states could apply for a grant to cover some of their asset management costs in a certain year by demonstrating that their new asset management programs, which includes life cycle costs, is a significant improvement over their previous asset management processes. Improving data resources was a consistent issue that came up with all of our case studies. The federal government has a role here because data is one of those things that can be transferred across states, and it can be standardized and put into a form that can be accessible to everybody and help improve the ability for LCCA to have accurate predictions. We thought that life cycle cost analysis could have a larger role in informing the STIP and the TIP, which is the planning documents required in the federal planning processes of states and MPOs. And finally, we thought that the federal government could develop or fund the development of a course for LCCA leaders. And this is not a course for how to do a life cycle cost analysis because that already exists. This is more a course for state and local level leaders to show them how to implement a life cycle cost program within their agency. Next slide. And then finally, we have our state and local recommendations. The first one is to establish a LCCA pilot program. We felt that this was a great way for agencies to start the process of looking at this economic tool to evaluate projects, and not only projects, but then a program of projects as well. And then the second recommendation on this list is building off of the first one. Once we have a pilot program, then the state can come in and say, we want this to stick around and we won't want it to be a pilot that just goes away. So introducing state legislation that helps the state DOT stabilize for the long term their pilot program and expand it to the rest of the agency. We also found that states can dedicate some more funding for workforce development, recognizing that states are very constrained in their budgets, certainly for workforce development, and certainly in an era where we're spending a lot of money trying to keep the system running. But a lot of the literature and people we talked to that had life cycle cost analysis in their program said that the upfront investment in developing a program for LCCA saved the agency in the long run and was worth the workforce development costs. And then finally, as we were just talking, partnering the private sector not only has benefits by using private sector incentives, but also the spillover effects of private sector knowledge coming into the public sector workers that are partnering with them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. You can advance to the next slide. Joshua Shank, President and CEO of the Eno Center for Transportation, is going to talk about some of the next steps for the industry and for us. And he and I are here to answer any questions that we can.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks everyone for listening to this this webinar today. This is Joshua Shank, and I just want to run through very quickly some of the things that Eno and ASCE will be doing to disseminate the findings of this research and analysis. It is our goal with every project, as it is for ASCE, to make sure that the findings and research that we develop is in the hands of people who can actually take action and do something with that analysis in order to improve policy. And so after we release any paper, we do our best to educate people about the findings as much as possible. And there are several components to that strategy. One is that we try to get as much press coverage as possible. That's been something we've been pretty successful with on this. However, we are going to continue that by pushing op-ed pieces and other articles that we can get written on this topic as widely as possible. And you'd be surprised how effective that is. A lot of policymakers won't take a meeting, but they will read the paper. And if they see things like one of the big takeaways from this paper that really caught the media's attention was the extent to which so much of the money that's coming out of the state, local, and federal government is being spent without the use of full-blown economic analysis or life cycle cost analysis guiding expenditure. And most people are not aware of that fact, and it's a pretty salient point that comes out of this paper. A second component of our strategy is to talk to people in government and to talk to them about the findings. We're doing that here in D.C., both with the legislative and executive branches, having meetings with folks on the Hill and the USDOT and the administration to talk about the findings of the report and see how we can be helpful to them as they think about the next surface transportation bill as it hopefully comes up for reauthorization this year. So we will be pursuing a full-blown strategy on that at the federal level, but the state and local level, and this is just for folks on the call who might be interested in, we are certainly willing to come and give briefings on the topic, talk to people at DOTs or other government agencies about the findings and see how we might be helpful based on what we've learned from case studies around the country if they are interested in moving forward with trying to implement greater use of life cycle cost analysis. It's certainly something we're willing to do. So those are the basic elements of our outreach strategy going forward. We certainly welcome any suggestions you might have on that front as well, but we'll now open it up for questions that anyone might have for Brian, Paul, and myself.
Well, thanks, Joshua, and thanks, Paul and Brian as well. We want to get to questions for our panelists this afternoon, and as I said at the top, you can ask a question by simply typing it directly into the GoToWebinar interface, and we'll collate those here, and I'll ask as many of your questions as time permits. Let me start off here with a question that may be a bit simplistic, but I think the answers are probably anything but. You know, we know that as a nation we are not currently investing enough in our infrastructure at all levels of government. We also know that the dollar amounts that we're talking about that it would take to adequately invest are, to most eyes, astronomical. They're hard to fathom for most folks. Our government's shooting themselves in the foot somewhat if they say right from the get-go that it's going to cost $1 billion to build the project and this much to maintain it and this much to reconstruct it 50 years from now. Aren't they already having enough trouble trying to convince folks that and try to come up with that initial $1 billion? You know, it sort of gets at this question of what are the incentives there for the public sector as things are now constituted in using life cycle cost analysis?
Yeah, this is Paul Livett. Yeah, I'm sorry. You know, one of the things that we found is, you know, that's true. And oftentimes with life cycle cost analysis, it shows you that if you're looking specifically at a design alternative, the upfront cost it might be better to make a more expensive project at first, and then that might save money over the 30 or 40 years life of that project. But I think what we've found is that when the public knows that the leaders in the DOT and the decision makers are using economic analysis and can say, look, this is why this is going to cost so much money, and this is why it's going to save us money in the long run, the public is much more accepting of those kind of decisions, because they can point to a transparent analysis and say, okay, that makes sense now.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I think that one of the problems that Brian mentioned at the beginning that we're facing in transportation and infrastructure generally is a lack of leadership. And leadership is partly about saying, we're going to spend more now to save money over the long run. I think that's a kind of a classic component of what leadership is. And the fact that we don't have political leaders who are generally willing to do that right now doesn't mean that we shouldn't have political leaders who are willing to do that right now. And it's not, running a government is not like running a corporation. I mean, you really don't want to just do well next quarter. You need to do well over the next 50, 100 years timeline, and that's the way we need to be thinking about transportation investment.
Yeah. One of the case studies in the PowerPoint and in the report is the Denver Eagle P3. And I was just out in Denver last week, and anybody who's been out there and had to take the super shuttle in from the airport or a $50 cab ride will know how great it's going to be be able to hop on the light rail and take that into Union Station a couple of years from now when that's all ready to go. And I'm wondering if one of you can speak a bit more to the role of the private sector in incorporating life cycle cost analysis, and what states and localities can sort of learn from them.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the thing is that the private sector, if they're going to operate something, is always going to think about life cycle cost analysis. It's kind of a bottom line question that they have to consider. The idea of not considering life cycle cost analysis is completely foreign to the private sector. So if you have an opportunity, like in the case of the P3, to use the private sector to build, operate, and maintain an asset, as they are doing with the light rail to the airport there, then of course they're going to be looking at the operating costs over the life of which that they're holding that asset, and consider that when they construct it. And so what happened there is that when they considered it, they realized that they could single track the line for a portion of the alignment and save about $300 million while providing the same level of service that had been required and mandated in the RFP. And so being able to do that was something that could not have happened had the public sector been taking full control of it, as they admit. I mean, RTD in Washington, in Denver, is run by Phil Washington, who's on our board of directors, and he has specifically said to us, look, we would never have come up with this idea because it's just not something that we were thinking about when we were thinking about the asset. I mean, we wouldn't have considered single tracking. But this is something that a private sector innovator can come up with because they don't operate under the same constraints that a lot of public sector agencies might.
The other issue, though, is, I guess that was sort of built into the P3 agreement and everything. But when private contractors sort of enter into a competitive bidding process, is it ever sort of not in their interest to provide a full accounting of the life cycle cost, since it could put them at a competitive disadvantage, when it comes to trying to get the project initially?
You're saying they could underbid based on trying to say, oh, the life cycle costs are lower?
Right.
Right, but with if you structure the P3 process correctly, which they did in Denver, then if they do that, then they're at risk, not the public sector. Like if they underbid and say, well, we think the costs are going to be X, and it turns out the costs are X plus $500 million, they're on the hook for that, not the public sector.
Yeah. What do we know about, have other countries sort of embraced life cycle cost analysis? We heard recently that China approved $113 billion in infrastructure projects over the last couple of months to try to bolster economic growth over there. And they presumably have a lot more greenfield projects than we do. But, you know, are they considering life cycle cost analysis in China?
That's a good question. Yeah, it's important to remember whenever we're thinking about China and their infrastructure, what a completely different political environment they're operating in, right? I mean, it's not even necessarily that it's a greenfield project. It's also that if they need to knock down people's homes and take them, it's really not a big challenge for them the way it is here. And that's probably a good thing that we have that system in place here. So we wouldn't want that kind of ability to plow through cities and neighborhoods in order to construct infrastructure here. But also, I think, you know, when they're thinking about life cycle costs in a huge high-growth country like that, they're going to be very different levels of costs than in a place like the United States, which is largely developed and largely built out its infrastructure. I mean, most of our infrastructure needs in transportation right now are maintaining what we have and making improvements to capacity at specific bottlenecks, not building a new system from scratch. So that changes your life cycle costs pretty dramatically.
Yeah, and I will say too, this is Paul at Eno. We've done some other, this paper did not get into international case studies, but we've looked at some other international examples of some peer nations, you know, like Canada and Australia, the UK, Germany, countries that have similar infrastructure to us, and they have started to use a lot more economic analyses, like life cycle cost analyses, recognizing that projects, you know, there's only a limited number of projects out there, and new projects, I guess, and most of the transportation dollars aren't spent on those new projects. They're spent on maintaining and operating the system that we have. And that's where life cycle cost analysis fits perfectly, when you're taking an asset and you're trying to figure out, how do I improve this, how do I rebuild it or maintain it in a way that will have the lowest long-term life cycle cost so that my maintenance budgets aren't out of control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in this country, sort of in the absence of significant infrastructure investment, we've seen a transition to a focus on system preservation or fix it first in a number of states. Why is life cycle cost analysis important even under that sort of scenario?
No, I would say that's exactly where life cycle cost is most directly relevant, because you know, we are seeing state and local DOTs spend most of their budgets on operations and maintenance, and it's the operations and maintenance that's missed when you don't have a life cycle cost analysis, and folks are just worried about keeping the bridge up and keeping that, you know, the traffic running on that, without thinking about how is this going to affect budgets 30 years down the road.
We've also heard a lot in recent years about states and communities trying to make transportation assets more resilient in the face of natural disasters and other catastrophic events. How can life cycle cost analysis help states better plan for unforeseen events like Hurricane Sandy or something like that?
You know, predicting unforeseen events like that is really difficult, and we just had a policy forum that was looking at that issue, and that's where life cycle cost analysis meets a risk analysis, and evaluating the certain probabilities and risks of major events like that, and planning infrastructure that can resist those kind of storms and other unforeseen events, and really what life cycle cost enables you to do is prove to the public and ultimately to, you know, your constituents that it's worth the extra investment, or it's worth this design modification, so that you know, based on the risk of this happening in the future, we'll be saving money in the long run.
The report mentions that life cycle cost analysis is used with greater frequency in other sectors, including building construction and water conservation projects and the energy transmission industry. What can the transportation industry learn from the experiences in those sectors?
I think that's definitely true. But a lot of those sectors are led by the private sector. So like we saw at the Denver P3, there's an inherent incentive to keep the long-term life cycle costs down, because they know that they're going to be operating this beyond their election cycle. You know, whether it's a transmission line owned by a power company or you know, a building that's owned by a investment trust. I mean, those companies are very concerned about not only their cost tomorrow, but the long-term viability of their asset. So I think that that's where we look at the private sector. We look at how do these companies do their life cycle cost analysis, what kind of costs they're including, and how do they project costs in the future.
We also hear a lot these days about trying to create greater transparency and accountability in government and trying to sort of restore the public's trust in government. How does life cycle cost analysis help contribute in those kinds of areas?
Well, certainly the way that we are envisioning it being used, that's the whole point, right, is that right now most transportation investment decisions are strongly influenced by the political process, horse trading, you know, putting projects into a STIP or a TIP is largely a political process. And of course, politics should be part of it. We're not arguing it shouldn't. But there should also be some cost criteria and hopefully benefit criteria as well that enter into that decision making and influence and create transparency around that decision making. So, you know, if elected officials want to say, well, this is our biggest priority in the state, this project, well, the public should know what the life cycle cost of that project is compared to other alternatives for the state to make where the state could be investing its money. That kind of transparency with respect to cost really helps keep elected officials honest when it comes to making decisions, so that they can't make them on a purely political basis. They at least have to acknowledge some of the cost issues going into these different projects.
And this is Paul. I would just add too that when you're developing these at a state or a local level, life cycle cost analysis when you're predicting future costs is tricky, and it's not always going to be right. And you know, it's an estimate of those future costs. And if you can publish the results of your economic analyses online and make them publicly available, although you do get some scrutiny, from the case studies we found that those agencies that made it public were able to get the best feedback from the public. They were able to refine their analyses in subsequent iterations and ultimately have better programs at the end of the day.
One of the other case studies you all have in the report and that you mentioned in the PowerPoint was the North Carolina case, and its new strategic transportation investments law. And that effort was to some degree billed as an effort to sort of get some of the politics out of the project selection process, because that's been an issue in that state for a long time. But Joshua, you're saying that it's not necessarily a bad thing, or the politics, you know, should factor in to some degree, right?
Of course. I mean, that's why we elect people, right? The democracy, and elected officials should represent the interests of their constituents, and constituents should have some say in which projects we select. And we're not arguing that there should be project selection purely based on cost-benefit analysis. That would be a terrible way to run a government. But that said, the pendulum has swung a little too far in the direction of using the political system alone without adequate analysis of costs and benefits to make transportation investment decisions. So creating greater transparency, putting in a greater level of and more sophisticated analysis would be a real step in the right direction.
And Paul, back to what you were talking about the accuracy of life cycle cost analysis. You know, how accurate can that be, and is the accuracy of our prognosticating tools improving? Has it improved over the years? Is this more than a guessing game at this point?
Well, it's certainly improving, and data is part of that, and better computing technologies are part of that. But I mean, ultimately, it's a guess, and any kind of guess like this is going to be wrong. I mean, you can never guess it perfectly, but it's certainly better than what we do. And the alternative is just kind of hope that 10 years from now we have the budget to maintain the asset. And if we have at least some idea of where these costs are going and an order of magnitude, it really does pan out to end up informing a decision that's a lot more beneficial in the long run.
The report notes that life cycle cost analysis in the past usually has been referenced with regards to pavement selection on transportation projects. States and communities still argue, though, the benefits of concrete versus asphalt on a state-by-state or even a project-by-project basis, and the selection of materials in a state or on a particular project is often based on a variety of factors. So, I guess it gets at this what we talked about a little bit earlier about sort of life cycle cost analysis is just sort of one tool in this whole process, right?
That's right. I mean, certainly we would never say that you should always use life cycle cost analysis so that we will never use asphalt again. I mean, that's not the point. The point is that there are certain cases where you might say, you know what, we're going to make the conscious decision to spend less money up front and pay more money in the long term because we have this following justification for doing that. There could be reasons why you would want to do that. And they could be political reasons. They could be budgetary reasons. There could be many reasons why. But the point is you want to have the analysis out there, that you want to have the transparency. You want to understand the trade-offs that you're making, not make them in a black box, so that people understand, like, okay, we see we're going to spend less now and spend more in the future, but we agree that that's the right decision, or we disagree. But that has to be put out there so that people can understand why the decision is being made.
So if Congress were to ever get its act together and produce another long-term surface transportation authorization bill, what are the chances it would include some of these concepts we're talking about today for moving life cycle cost analysis forward, and would those be an easy sell politically, do you think?
Well, Brian may have his own perspective. Our perspective is that we think there's a real opportunity to introduce greater accountability for both costs and outcomes and performance outcomes in the next bill. And the reason we think that is that MAP 21, the last legislation that passed in 2012, included numerous steps in that direction, including creation of national goals, creation of performance measures for evaluating those goals, a requirement that states set targets for achieving those goals. So there was a lot of progress in that direction in the last bill, and we believe we can build on that with respect to life cycle cost analysis by pushing this as another tool by which to evaluate investments effectively, and one that frankly is already being used in some places and people are a little more comfortable with than some of the other tools that have been pushed to evaluate performance. So we think that there is a real opportunity, and there is an openness, assuming that we solve the revenue problem. There is an openness to getting this into the next surface transportation bill.
Mm-hmm. I would just say I'd concur with Joshua. I think there's an interest by lots of members of Congress and their staff to actually have some of those tools available to better utilize the resources available. And while we certainly are pushing for a larger bill and a longer term bill, even if that comes to pass, and we hope that it will, and that's what we're working for, we still want to be able to spend the money more wisely and more effectively. So regardless of the funding levels, these tools are going to help us improve the way we deliver projects and the types of projects we deliver.
Right. So the report also indicates that some of the federal discretionary programs like the Recovery Act and Tiger might provide sort of a roadmap in terms of how to create incentives for using life cycle cost analysis and other types of economic analysis. What can policymakers draw from those specifically?
Well, the thing about the Tiger program is that they put out this money from the Recovery Act to be available for anyone who wanted to apply, basically any government entity that wanted to apply for these grants. And they said you have to do cost-benefit analysis if you want to get this money. And lo and behold, a lot of places figured out a way to do cost-benefit analysis in order to try to get that money. And some of them did a really terrible job, and some did a very good job. But through that process, I mean, there were thousands of Tiger applications. There have been every year, but there have only some of those projects, a small fraction of those projects are actually selected. So what you've got is basically a training program in cost-benefit analysis for government agencies around the country, because they're all trying to get this money, and even if they don't get it, they are learning how to perform these analyses. So that's an example of how a discretionary grant program can really move the ball forward on analytics, because you're putting money out there that otherwise would not be available for places that, of course, as Brian mentioned, as we've all talked about, are in desperate need of more money. And you're putting that money out there and making it available under the contingency of performing this analysis. And that goes a really long way towards developing the skills that are necessary.
Okay. Well, unless anybody else has any additional thoughts, anybody have any closing thoughts for this afternoon? Okay. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and we appreciate having everybody on this afternoon. I want to thank our speakers, Brian Palish from the American Society of Civil Engineers, Joshua Shank and Paul Lewis from the Eno Center for Transportation. This webinar will be archived on the CSG Knowledge Center. And here's how you can tweet us if you're into that sort of thing. Next slide. Here's one place to find the full ASCE and Eno report online, and it may be available elsewhere as well. You can also Google the title, which is Maximizing the Value of Investments Using Lifecycle Cost Analysis. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. Be sure to keep an eye on the CSG.org for future eCademy events. And we are adjourned. Thanks very much.